Well, hi, everybody, and welcome. I'm Marc Cook. I'm the managing editor of BuyDanJohnson.com. Soon to become Affordable Aviation. When is soon? I don't know. Check out the site. You'll see. That's a note to my IT guys. We are here to talk about Mosaic a little bit. And as most of you know, the Mosaic program the proposal has been out for a while. We're kind of in that period where the FAA is chewing on it. We've had an opportunity for some user and pilot feedback. We've had feedback from the industry. And I thought it'd be really a good opportunity to look at where we are in the proposal, kind of check in on the timeline and figure out is any of this stuff really imminent? Rather than pontificate on my own, I brought together a couple of guys who know their stuff, been watching the industry a long time. That was Scott Severen over there. Scott, welcome. Scott is the current president of LAMA or LAMA. I never say llama because I always think of the animal, but he has some perspective on this as well. And of course, Dan Johnson is with us here. Needs no introduction. Dan has been part of the LSA ecosystem, if you will, since the very beginning, and has been a huge proponent of LSA. And I think, Dan, you may be too modest to accept it, but a big part of the success of LSA. Gentlemen, thank you. I appreciate you taking some time this morning. Dan, I want to start with you. We're going to look at the time frame a little bit for Mosaic. What do you see in terms of bring us up to speed? I think on where we are in the time, the overall arc of Mosaic.
Well, let's back up a little bit then, Mark, and go back to when FAA announced at Oshkosh 22 that they were going to come out with the regulation, the draft proposal, of course, by August 23. And myself and many others doubted the fact of that statement, but that's what they said at the time. And indeed, they came out with it not only by August 23, but they came out with it in July, which was slightly ahead of schedule. And honestly, it looked like it got out a little ahead of schedule because there were things in it that clearly needed to be changed and whatnot. But to their credit, they got it out. They got it out early. And for the most part, I've divided this into two halves. There's the pilot side and there's the airplane side. On the airplane side, it was pretty much like what we expected because we'd been getting some information. And indeed, that seemed to be, well, not only what we expected, but more than we expected. For example, the speed jumping all the way up to 250 knots. Nobody thought that was coming, or at least I didn't know anyone that thought that was coming. So here we are with that having come out in July, the draft proposal. And then it got opened up for a comment window, which is normally 90 days, but those can often be extended. And indeed they were when a group of 8 maintenance organizations went, well, we need a little more time to study this. So they pretty much automatically extended it by another 90 days. Now that takes us to like second quarter 25 before that will come out, because FAA has repeatedly said 16 months from the close of the comment window we need that time to go over all the comments. They have to read every single one and make changes to it, make changes they thought they needed, make changes that the community thought were valuable and that they also could bless. So they've got quite a bit of work to do to get that done. And I've recently understood there may be some lengthening to that as well. But at this time, what I know is about second quarter 2025, we may see this ruled, and maybe with a little slippage on that.
And at that point, we may have another opportunity for a set of adjustments and things like that. And we'll come back to sort of the underpinnings of this rulemaking in terms of the F-37 committee and the ASTM aspects of this, who've been working, I won't say side by side with the FAA, but certainly they have been watching what's going on. The committee has been very, very busy. And what surprised me is they're really touching every aspect of this. They're looking at maintenance, they're looking at pilot training, they're looking at all of this stuff. And I think it's probably useful to recap at this point that what we're looking at is a dramatic expansion of LSA. So the airplanes can get significantly faster, as you say, from 120 to 250 knots. They're going to get heavier, although there's a little asterisk to that because the idea was to limit the maximum gross weight by limiting stall speed. And that's kind of one of the most contentious aspects, I think, from the industry side of things, from the original proposal. That it was set up at 54 knots clean, There are a lot of people saying, well, that really excludes a lot of airplanes that we think ought to be in Mosaic, that if you say, well, logically, this makes sense to be in Mosaic, but really are excluded from it because of that limitation. So it's this big expansion of the airplanes themselves. It touches on a few things like we can have electric propulsion. It doesn't have to be a piston power plant, stuff like that, that I think is really good and forward thinking. But there's still, like you say, Dan, there's still a lot of work to be done. And of course, there's the pilot thing. Scott, I'd like to come to you and get your perspective on sort of where we've been and from a sort of a little bit more of a manufacturer side. Is this really going to help us in terms of the new airplanes and what potentially could come out?
Well, yeah, sure it will. It'll certainly open up the availability for what sport pilot airmen can fly. Of course, the current sport pilot airmen won't be able to fly a 250 knot retractable gear complex airplane. Right? There'll be additional training that'll be required for that sport pilot to be able to exercise the privileges for the more complicated aircraft, heavier and faster. And remember, I get asked often, will the current light sport market just be devastated by Mosaic? And if anything, I think Mosaic will help boost the current light sport market because we all know that aviation costs by the pound and by the knot. And so for those that are at least casually economically driven in their aviation pursuits, the current light sport aircraft are going to stay about at their price point. They might go up as everything goes up, but the new, bigger, heavier, faster light sport aircraft are not going to cost what current light sport aircraft cost. And we recall way, way back when light sport started out, it was going to be the $60,000. Well, yeah, that really didn't come to pass. And there were a few ultralight type light sport aircraft that fit that model, but not too many really, because it's market driven and manufacturers develop what the customer wants. Let me just add on to, though, Mark, when you were talking about the timeline, there's another issue that's associated with the FAA enacting the rule, and that is it's all ASTM based, and without a standard, you can't effectively use the rule, and you can't create the standard unless you know what the rule is. So once the rule comes out, ASTM has to create the standard, and then it has to be accepted by FAA. Now, granted, much of the standards are being worked on now, and they'll be pretty close. We've got some pretty good ideas of where things will lie, but we don't know the details in some areas of where they lie. And if there's an area in the new rule that has quite a ripple effect in the standards, it will take some reworking of the standards. We, as you commented, there has been some collaboration with the FAA and the ASTM. Personally, I sit on ASTM, and LAMA sits on the ASTM committee as well, committees. And the last discussion we had with the FAA, where they seek feedback, they it's in ex parte, so they can't discuss the rule, but they can request feedback. And one of the questions that FAA said was, well, how long do you think it'll take to make the standard once the rule comes out? And wow, several on the F-37 committee were saying 12 months. Yeah, are you kidding me? At least. And the FAA was saying, well, we were hoping it'd be like 1 or 2 or 3 months. Yeah, well, rule or standard writing is complicated, just as FAA has to check with all the different divisions within the FAA that everything is suitable through medical, through legal, through flight standards. The same thing occurs in the standards writing process, that everything is consistent and complementary and harmonious. So the general consensus is 6 to 9 months. Depending on, and that gives a little fudge factor on either direction, depending on how different the rule is from what was proposed. And we know there are some areas of concern. So So yes, the second or third quarter of 2025, if all goes well, but understand also that FAA, I firmly believe, is committed to making this rule right. But we know the rule came out pretty quickly, and hurrah! I think everyone applauds the FAA for their activity and how quickly they got the rule out. But there are a few holes in it, as we know, and of course you've got the different stakeholders that will want to comment on those. FAA, if they see a suggestion from industry that makes more sense or that fills a hole that was in the regulation, they'll look at that and see if that makes sense and integrate that into the rule. That's excellent, and it takes time because they've got to, one, create the solution, validate it through the different divisions in FAA, and then integrate it into the rule. So each time that occurs, that takes time. And I firmly believe the FAA is sincere in wanting to put together a real good rule. So they'll take the time that's required. If they see issues, they're going to address them, I believe.
Yeah. Let me jump in just quickly with the process that most people are not exposed to, but could be. Anyone can join. Anyone can join ASTM, and I mean regular users and everybody else. Matter of fact, more users is good. They have a balance they need to keep between producers and users. So if you, listener, want to join ASTM and you think you've got anything to contribute and you do not need to be an engineer, please do so. But here's how the process works. They beat these things around pretty good in what are called task groups, small collections of people that have an interest in that thing. And because they have an interest, they tend to be all over it. And they will bat it around. But in those task groups and in the main F-37 committee meeting, FAA is an active and regular participant. This doesn't all happen and then it gets sent to FAA and they ponder over it and send it back with notes or whatever. No, they're in there from the beginning. So by the time the committee ballots, they call it balloting, call it voting if you like, and they will assess a certain standard and ask for everybody to vote on it. And at that time, people can say, well, it's all pretty good, but this one part here needs to be fixed. That will stop that process in its tracks right there. Now, then that has to be proven to be an acceptable change or a non-acceptable change. And if it's judged to not be important or wasn't a good enough suggestion, then they'll move on and go back and continue on with the process. Otherwise, they'll go back and amend it. But meanwhile, FAA is there the whole time. When the thing is successfully balloted or voted upon and everyone agrees to it, then it gets sent to FAA for something called an NOA or Notice of Availability. And basically, FAA just reviews it to see if it's what they thought. But they had been in there all along. So there's no great surprises here. And this committee has been working hard and amazingly fast, if you ask me, for 3 years now on this thing because we had an idea what was coming. So we're not getting this draft from them or the final version from them going, okay, let's see what we got to do now. No, we're way ahead of that. And there will be changes and so forth. But this process happens far faster than when government handles it alone, as they do in Part 23 and other systems.
I think that's a really important point because traditionally the certification process has been driven by the FAA and you are given a set of requirements to be met and then you go about testing and proving that your design meets that certification. And with this opportunity now to expand light sport, the industry in the form of the ASTM groups has come out and said, this is what we think will work. This is what we think we can produce. And the interesting thing to me is it's been really forward looking. There's an eVTOL group in here. There's electric propulsion advocates in here. So we're not starting with how can we make a Cessna 152 into a light sport aircraft. It's more like, what do we do today that will pay some dividends down the road? And I think that is super important because, whether you believe it's eVTOL or electric propulsion or whatever, the face of aviation is going to change in the next few years. And to lock a rule down into what we think is right in 2024, which is really kind of 2022 thinking, can be a bit short-sighted. So I got to give both the ASTM group, LAMA, and the FAA, kudos for saying let's not lock us down to something that's going to be obsolete as soon as we sign the papers. So.
FAA takes some heat for many reasons, and some of those reasons are very valid, and they should take the heat for them. But in this case, when this went way back to when the process started, FAA went, okay, we're not only going to let you do more of this, we're going to really loosen the leash here, and you go do it, industry. And we'll look at it when we're done. Now, it's not quite that simple. I just described a moment ago how it works more accurately, but that's the basic idea. You figure it out. You guys can make decisions quickly. You're not caught up in our procedures acts and all the rest of the things government has to follow. You can just make a decision, get it done. If there's something urgent, a change can happen in 30 days. I mean, that doesn't happen in Part 23.
No, that's a really important point. And I think also the recognition that light aircraft like this really don't need to be to the same certification level as you would a Boeing or an Airbus or something like that. Which actually kind of brings me to my next question, which is I think everybody's expecting when the rule becomes final that there are a number of airplanes that are currently light sport that adhere to that but I'm going to call them edge cases in the sense that they're airplanes that could really benefit from another couple hundred pounds of gross weight. Some airplanes maybe that are faster than the limitation now that could be unlocked. What, Scott, I'm going to go to you with this first. I mean, what do you see as sort of the first reaction out of industry in terms of the airplanes that we know now?
Well, certainly there'll be an influx of more capable aircraft, and we're seeing many of them now that exist. The Jabiru makes a 4-seat aircraft that's sold in the United States as a 2-seater without the rear seats in it, so that it fits the light sport definition. When light sport definition allows 4 seats, then the 4-seater will be, so you'll have ready to fly 4-seat aircraft, not just from Jabiru, but Sling and many of the other manufacturers as well are ready to bring those products to market, not just, and the faster airplanes, the airplanes that are just on the edge. The Lightning is an airplane that comes to mind, and several others that are a little above what light sport are, will now be able to be factory built instead of experimental or flown under experimental exhibition, which is an area that's oftentimes used.
And I'll add another thought too, is that in other countries, aircraft like this are already permitted under their regulation schemes in those countries. And this is a global phenomenon here. This is not just this is a U.S. rule, of course, what we're talking about here. And U.S. rules do get absorbed by other countries with some regularity, but they also have plenty of their own ideas. And so some of these aircraft are, many of them, kind of already ready and maybe approved in their countries. So we're not talking as long a spool up time as you might think based on historical information.
I think we already have a handful of airplanes out there that the manufacturers would be happy to press the go button on. The Sparker, the TL Sparker that I just got to see at Sun and Fun is a good example. There's an airplane that is currently built. The only way you can own it really is to go and do the factory builder assist program. Dan, I did want to ask you, one of the criticisms, if you will, about the LSA rules as we've lived with for 20 plus years now is it's tough to make an airplane light enough to get in the rule and have it have a decent amount of useful load and fuel capacity. Do you think that we're going to see a number of these legacy airplanes suddenly get another 100 pounds, 200 pounds of gross weight, assuming that the engineering has been done on it?
Well, not only, yes, do I see that, but the airplanes are already ready. Maybe most of them, not most of them, but some of them were already reduced in carrying capacity and to meet the gross weight. They were already approved for and tested for and built for and all the rest to carry higher loads or go faster or other things. So, yeah, it'll be a fairly simple thing to do. Now, they'll have to go prove that. And that's what the ASTM standards are about. They'll say, well, here's the line items that you got to meet in order to do what you're talking about doing here. And if they meet those, then they'll be able to do that. But some of these companies are really well prepared. Scott's company, Jabiru, and several others that he mentioned, quite a series of them. They're basically ready now. They're just waiting on the regulation to come out so they can tick all the boxes and go, yep, did that, did that, did that. And then I think we'll see these airplanes with surprising swiftness. Although that's always a dangerous thing to say because
right.
Stuff manages to stumble no matter what you do.
So I think that gets back to one of the original questions: is what does the Mosaic rule do to the LSA ecosystem? Does it depress the value of the airplanes? Does it increase the value of the airplanes? What does it do? And I think it's a little too early to tell. However, my gut says it's going to improve the viability of a lot of these airplanes for some pilots, in the sense that they go, well, maybe that's a little too light. It doesn't quite do what I need it to do. But I don't think you need a huge increment to really to change the dynamic there. And I you guys, I would love to hear your comments on this. My sense of the matter is the people who are going to be shopping now all of a sudden say, okay, now as a sport pilot, I can go fly an old Cherokee or an old 172 or something like that. There's really two distinctly different markets. There's those guys who go, fine, I don't want to deal with the medical stuff anymore, but I still want to fly the tried and true Cessnas and Cherokees. They're going to go and do that. But I think there's a substantial part of the market that wants a newer airplane, wants newer technology, wants a better looking airplane. No offense to Cessnas and Pipers, but is really not going to is not spring loaded into going looking for old Cherokee 140s to restore. Does that make sense to you guys?
Gosh, I sure think so. The opportunity, you hit right on it, Mark, to get new hardware with current avionics, with the level of sophistication and safety that's added with current avionics is amazing. Smart glide, auto level, all these features, the traffic avoidance, all of these things that you see in every light sport just about, that you don't see in the legacy Part 23 aircraft unless it's a higher performance on Saratoga or Mooney or something, but certainly not that Cherokee 120 that's sitting out on the line.
And very expensive. And the problem is very expensively upgraded. So that's the other issue we run into.
No, it absolutely is. And acquisition cost is one part, but the ownership cost of those older aircraft, I hear horror stories of the cost to get an annual done on my 1960 something. Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
And the cost of ownership on the newer technology light sport aircraft and MLSA will be much lower.
Yeah. Dan, do you have anything to add to that?
Well, just that in many cases, these companies have been doing this all along. So this is easy ground for them to pick up and cover. And so they make some changes to it. And the user out there says, oh, well, really all I needed was another 100 pounds of useful load. Well, that may be one of the easiest things to solve. But these airplanes that are already out there, first of all, there is a whole used group of airplanes out there now. We have 20-year-old LSA that are very modest in price. So the many people I hear who say, well, I sure wish I could go fly a, pick your number, Cessna 150, Cessna 172, Cherokee this, and whatever. Well, any of those, and they're great legacy airplanes, and they're already heavily amortized in their expenses, and so they're available for a lot less price, no question. But they're old.
Yeah.
And they're very old. They're 50 years, 60 years old, and they have analog equipment in them, and the pieces and parts are just worn. Whereas you can buy a fairly new, relatively new LSA that'll be maybe 15 years old. And it's got its own challenges, of course. Everything that gets older does, but these are much newer airplanes, and some of them are at very attractive prices. Now, all prices of everything is going up. We all know this. Go to the grocery store. You'll get your own eye shock when you look at the prices of things that you remember from just 4 years ago. So the same thing has happened to airplanes, and we can't blame the producers for this. It's not their fault.
Sure.
But numbers will go up, but value should still be pretty good. And these legacy LSA, if you want to call them that, the 1,320 or 1,430 pound aircraft, still do everything they did when they were new. And now we'll have demonstrably better prices than the things with lots of new capabilities. So you have to pick your what you can afford. It's the same game it's always been. Affordable aviation is one of those hard to define areas because everybody's different.
A curious observation is the oldest light sport aircraft is how old, viewers? 20 years old?
Yeah, 20 years old this year.
Planes come into our shop and they go, oh, yeah, man, that's an old one. That one's 12 years old. Oh, sounds pretty good to the general aviation market.
Sounds pretty new to them. Right? Yes, right.
And
exactly right.
a lot of it depends on how it was used. I mean, some of them are used in training, but a lot of these are personal aircraft that don't get flown a lot of hours. They're not subjected to the same things as, you know, my hangar is really close to the runway, and I hear what the 150s and the 172s go through every single day. And you know, I'm not sure I would buy a former trainer, frankly. So I think that's a fair point. That really our ecosystem has a lot newer airplanes who are more likely to be treated kindly and maintained well. So that's always a positive. Let me just switch gears just a little bit, guys. Some of the proposals in Mosaic have elicited some industry response, and including a series of responses from Gamma that wanted to see a sort of a bifurcation, if you will, of the four-seat class, including placing some of the airplanes into the primary category rather than let it roll through the ASTM process. What's your view on that, Dan? We'll start with you.
Primary category wasn't that great in the early 1990s, and it hasn't gotten any better. That's the simple and short answer to it. And the recreational pilot license that went along with it, well, that was even a bigger dud. So, yes, those legacy approval systems, they're fine. And here's where it does help. Some companies, Cessna, Icon, made this decision. If you want to get into other countries with your product, you need to meet some more standard regulatory system, and industry consensus standards is just not well understood in some places. So yeah, even though it's old and a dinosaur, in my opinion, it still has its value, I guess, but it's costly. And why do that when you've got Mosaic coming now that will, I predict, go around the world and people are going to pick up on it? Matter of fact, Brazil already front ran the FAA. They've already got a system out that's very much like this. And by the way, they did go with 61 knots.
I know it's like if Brazil can do it, we can do it. I think it's Scott. I'm going to get right back to you here, but I think it's important to note that the certification processes, you know, historically the FAA has in the U.S. has led the world. When we approve something, it doesn't take much for other countries to go, well, you know, and you can see it from their standpoint. If you're a smaller country and you have a small aircraft certification department, it's like, well, you know, it's easy to have some cover because the FAA is a pretty big, pretty successful program for that. So I would say, you know, Mosaic, whatever the final rule is, may not have instant gratification, if you will, around the world, but it won't be long because it's pretty easy to hide behind that, if you will. Scott, you had something to add to this?
Well, and not only acceptance for Mosaic around the world, but there are manufacturers around the world wanting to get in the United States market. I was just at Aero Friedrichshafen last week, and LAMA hosted a meeting for manufacturers over there, and it was very, very well attended. There were, 30 or 40 in attendance, and all eagerly wanting to understand what the regulatory framework is, how it's evolving for the United States, because they're called ultralights in Europe, in many of the countries there, that are not like an ultralight in the United States. You've got to change gears and think something entirely. We're talking ultralights that'll fly 200 miles an hour. It's a different, and many companies then over in Europe are real interested in what goes on with the Mosaic so that they can bring their product in the United States. And it would be great if there were harmonization throughout the planet. At our LAMA meeting, I invited EASA, the European Aviation Safety Association, to come in and give a little talk on their updated Part 21 Light, which is a self-declarative process for certification of aircraft. And that's been released for some time now, and they've had 0 applicants to take advantage of it. Because it's more limited than the definition for light sports in the United States, and it's not harmonized, and I think we see this around the world as each country feels like we can do it best, and so we're going to do it our way, versus harmonizing and trying to collaborate and make a regulation that works for a world economy, and that is just not happening very effectively.
Now, guys, we haven't really talked too much about the sport pilot side of things. We know that that's going to be a useful expansion for a lot of pilots. But that's one that I think there are some variables still that are in the FAA's hands. We don't really have quite as clear a picture on. What are you guys seeing? Dan, let's go to you. What do you see coming down the road, just very briefly, for the sport pilot?
Well, I'm going to return to my theme about there's the pilot side and there's the aircraft side. A lot of what we've been talking about is the aircraft side, and honestly, that's intriguing to a lot of people and seems to suggest the capabilities that will follow. What we know a lot less about is the pilot licensure and operating limitations side. That comes from a group called Flight Standards as opposed to aircraft certification. Those are the two main groups we're dealing with. Many others have a say in this, but those are the main two. And the pilot guys talked to us for a little while, and then it just kind of stopped. So we don't really know what exactly they will do, and that's not up to the industry like the airplane side is. However, you get kind of a response to it that people say, well, but that's what I want to do. And FAA has heard a lot about that. In fact, some of our questions that you fielded relate to that side of it more than the airplane side, because we know more about the airplane side. We've already talked about that. We know less about the other. So when we get back to that again, I think it's going to be difficult for people to go, well, but can't we just say how this goes? No, that's not up to us. That's all FAA to make some of these decisions. And they have heard what people said, and I have hoped that they'll make some of the right moves. But again, we just don't know yet. So we're just going to have to wait on that part of it. So that complicates the airplane side of it a little bit too. Well, does a pilot have to have a certain credential to fly this or that airplane that we have created or modified from one we had before? And the answer is we don't know that yet. So the situation is not as complete as we would like it to be. And there are just some areas we can't answer yet while FAA is head down getting this thing finished.
Right. Scott, do you agree with that?
No, that's exactly correct. The devil is in the details, and we don't know what those details are yet.
And the devil does have them. So
right, exactly. And so, and of course, the other thing is, it's not just the pilot certification; it's maintenance issues and things like that. Who's going to be able to work on the airplanes? I think it's fair to say that the repairman certificate and the maintenance paradigm around LSA has been very successful. I think it's worked well. I mean, we should really loop back to sort of the overarching issue here is that LSA has been a success. It's proven itself over 20 years. It has a very good safety record. All of the things, and, Dan, I think we were all around when this came out, and all the things that people feared, well, you're going to have flimsy little airplanes that are going to ball themselves up and pilots are going to die, blah, 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 just has not come to pass. And the industry has proven itself. Now, would it have been nice to know that we kind of knew that after 10 years? It didn't necessarily take 20 to be able to upgrade it, but here we are.
There's a word I think you may have been looking for there that is kind of a subtle way that the industry has responded to FAA and the pilot side of it. And I think the word there is endorsements. And that has been a very successful scheme, if you want to call it that, within the LSA world. And it's the pilot side of it, actually, where let's say you get a sport pilot certificate and you do so in something like a Quicksilver, a very innocuous airplane that doesn't require a great deal of skills in certain areas, like how to use an autopilot and things like that. And you learn how to fly this thing. And then you go, well, now I've got a couple hundred hours. I've been safe. I want to fly into a Class B airport. Oh, no, you can't do that with a sport pilot certificate. Yes, you can. It just takes an endorsement. And an endorsement is a marvelous thing because you go fly with your instructor, the one you already know and who knows you. And that individual gives you some additional training about how to enter Class B, what the requirements are, and what you should and shouldn't do. And then you can get signed off. That individual just signs your logbook. He endorses it, therefore the name, and you're ready to go. That does not involve FAA. There is no other flight check. There's no written test. This is a marvelous thing. And people were saying about that as well at the outset, Mark, oh, that's going to cause all kinds of problems. You can't have these people just go out and get a check ride with an instructor and go do these dangerous things. Well, nonsense. The record FAA has said over and over, their word is a safety record has been, quote, acceptable, close quote. That's FAA's fairly high praise, saying, yeah, you guys have actually done pretty well.
Yeah, I mean, they're related to the mechanic. There have been questions about that, and that is something we don't know how that's going to go. LAMA is concerned about the changes that are being proposed for the repairman certificate. As you stated, the system that we've got has worked very well. But the changes that FAA is proposing is that there's a couple of issues that we've had as LAMA, as an advocacy association, is that a mechanic may not approve for return to service any aircraft or part unless that person has previously performed the work concerned satisfactorily. And so to us, that doesn't make sense. It should be worded that that person has successfully completed appropriate training for the work performed, versus it's kind of a catch-22. How do you should you do it on your plane, Mark? Perform satisfactorily first, and then the FAA will allow them. Anyway, so that's one of the concerns that we've got with the NPRM. Another concern we've got is that the FAA is proposing that the existing hours-based training requirements for the repairman maintenance rating require applicants complete a training course that aligns more with the aviation mechanic, general airframe, and power plant airman certification standards. And I understand where that pressure comes from. To become a light sport repairman takes 3 weeks, and to become an AMP takes a year or two.
Sure.
And so I understand the cause for concern and the scratching of the head is, does that make any sense? Well, it does make sense because it's worked very well for 20 years.
Yeah.
The system in place has training modules. So you learn, and basic hour requirements. So you learn specific modules. You learn about fixed wing. You learn about weight shift. You learn about inflatable wing. And so it makes sense to us to what's working, keep doing what's working, and allow specific training modules to be added to the existing LSRM or light sport repairman courses with information specific to the aircraft components and technologies such as retractable gear, because that's being discussed, such as constant speed propeller. So you have a module specific for that. So now you'll get new propulsion systems. Now you'll have specifically trained mechanics working on your aircraft versus a very respectfully generally trained AMP that may not understand these technologies. And in fact, it would probably be smart for those AMPs to take these training modules to understand this technology. But there's already a system in place, and they could, in fact. There's already a system in place that...
And they do already do that, yes.
Right.
Yes. Right.
I think the original question had to do with timeframes, and I think we did discuss early 2025 is when we might see publishing of something from the FAA. I'd like you guys to think about what that means in practical terms. There's probably going to be a little bit of back and forth. It depends on who you are. We discussed this a little bit, but if you guys were betting men, when do you think we would see an actual final Mosaic that we can start building airplanes around? Dan, do you want to take that one?
Sure, it's easy. AirVenture 2025.
2025.
FAA loves to announce these things at big venues. They're a PR organization too, and they have good people that do that, and they will be pushing very hard, I predict, to make their announcement then, and I predict then it will go, it'll be released fully by early September like that, pretty much as they did with LSA, and pretty much as they did many years ago with Part 103, which followed a kind of a similar scheme. But nonetheless, today, all those LSA out there today are just fine choices for people to go fly. There is no need to sit here and wait for your perfect airplane to come down the line, because when you do find it, there'll be a line there of other people that want that too. And as we know, airplanes are at least months, if not years, to delivery at this time. That's not suddenly going to get a lot faster when Mosaic comes out. In fact, it's going to get slower. So if you want to go fly.
Yeah, Dan is more optimistic than I am. I think because you need the standard as well. So the rule could be passed in 2025. It's an election year, which takes some of the priorities of those in FAA into, it steals resources. And also, if there are any modifications or adjustments that need to be done to the rule, those take time to do. So I'm hopeful that we could get a rule released by AirVenture. Perhaps so. That would be terrific. It could ease into 2026. Even if it does occur in 2025, you still need to have a standard. You can't have the rule you can't fly them unless you have standards, because the rule is based on standards. So that at best case is 3 months and probably 6 to 9 months to adjust the standards to meet the rule. And then the FAA has to accept the rule, which they probably, that won't take a bunch of time, but that is another process, and everything just takes a little bit of time. So I would hope that we're flying MLSAs in 2026. That would be a home run in my view.
Well, let's insert one thing in between that, because both points are valid, I think. But I'm going to pick on Scott's airplane because he's got one that's just perfectly attuned to it, and he can obviously address it. But the current, your J230D airplane is a 4-seater in Australia now, has been for a long time, actually. So all the documentation is there for you to quickly, not you, but Jabiru down in Australia, to quickly say, well, here's all the documentation you guys require. And we know that this airplane can handle a higher weight. Now, some of the other things, going 250 knots, that may be something else, but the larger weight, that's one of the biggest things people are looking for. You could do that, and several other companies too. I'm just picking you because you can address it here, but you could come in pretty quickly with this thing. So yes, if you want that magic airplane that does 250 knots and carries everything in the world and does all that stuff, yeah, you might have to wait till 26 or 7 or 8 for that. I don't know. But you could have a Jabiru J230 with more carrying capacity, if not 4 seats, probably a lot quicker than that. Not immediately after the rule is released, but a lot sooner. So if you're dying to have something new, I think you'll be able to do it. You may not have everyone available right away. But again, I'll go back to, there's a lot of great airplanes out there right now whose prices are much lower, and you ought to get out there and fly them.
That's great. Thanks, guys. I think to sum up, somewhere in between a major announcement at AirVenture 2025 to a practical implementation sometime in that year. And again, we'll see what the rules will actually be around the sport pilot aspects of it. That's still some question marks. But I think overall we have a lot of momentum with Mosaic. And what I would like to leave people with is that just because it's gone a little bit quiet doesn't mean anything other than the FAA is chewing on it. And truthfully, the FAA has a lot of priorities. I know the people who are working on this program are really dedicated to it, but they have more than one thing to do during the day, and so we have to have a little bit of patience for it. But I think we've come a long way from the original ideas from this, and I think the fact that LSA has been successful stands us in really good stead here, and I'm pretty optimistic for where this can go. So thanks again, guys, for taking your time today. I appreciate it, and thanks for everybody who tunes in to the By Dan Johnson Affordable Aviation site. We appreciate your patronage and views, and let us know what you think. And we'll see you the next time we do one of these.